Hello everyone, and thanks for listening in to this presentation. My name is Willy Vandenbrande. I'm a consultant in quality management from Belgium, and I'm also an ASQ fellow and an academician to the International Academy for Quality. It is indeed an honor and a pleasure to have been invited to talk to you at the occasion of the 50th anniversary of Sandholm Associates. The title of my presentation is Quality for the Unpredictable World, and the key topic is why quality is absent in services and what to do about it. Let's have a look at the content of this presentation. I'll start with a little introduction and the motivation for writing it. Then I will focus on the quality language we use, which is actually one of the problems we are faced with when expanding our activities to service. But the bulk of the presentation will be topic 3 and 4 here, the quality methods, and specifically the limitation of our current quality methods, and what we can do about it, how we can handle unpredictability in order to have a bigger impact on the quality of services. I'll end with a couple of conclusions. Now, let's have a look at the introduction, and the subtitle of my speech is Why We Are Absent in Services. Well, what I want to point out here is that we are very much absent in services. In fact, in an economy that consists for 75% of services, quality tends to focus on 25% of manufacturing. I have a couple of numbers to illustrate this. Recently, I asked ASQ about their membership, and this is the information I got just as recent as January 2021. If you look at where people are coming from that are ASQ members, well, 73% is from manufacturing, 17% from services, and you need to see this as commercial services, and then 7% healthcare, 3% education. Of course, one could say in a broad sense these are just as well services. So in fact we have a 73-27 division, but in favor of manufacturing. I also asked a local quality organization that I very regularly work for what their turnover was in 2020, and they had a look at all their invoices, and in fact about 70% of what they invoiced was to manufacturing companies, only about 30% to service organizations. So it is clear that we are very present in manufacturing, but not very present in service industries. Now, why would that be? And I see two major causes for that. The first one is a communication issue. I called it here lost in translation, but this has to do with the language we use. I'll come back to that in a second. The second problem is a much more fundamental one. I called it here lost in the unpredictable world, and this is about the fact that the tools we have are not really suited for the types of problems we are faced with. Now let's have a look at this language problem that I called lost in translation. And to illustrate it, I again gathered some data. I took a Certified Six Sigma Black Belt primer containing a lot of sample questions, and I took out the 5 key chapters: define, measure, analyze, improve, control. Now, if you read these questions, most of them are general / theoretical, okay, which in itself might not be that good, but anyway, that's what you see. 68 of them specifically mention production, product, manufacturing. However, out of the 274 questions, only 2 can be related to services. Only 2, so that is less than 1%. Now, Six Sigma Black Belt function is totally independent of sector is independent of environment. But it is clear that the message that is given is that this is something for people in production and not for people in services. You see the same when implementing lean. Of course, Toyota and the Toyota production system is a very often used example, but one can wonder whether it is really the example to use when talking to healthcare people, for instance. I also see that a lot of consultants like to use a lot of Japanese words. Again, I don't think that is very wise to gather interest in a methodology. We need to look at the fundamentals, the meaning behind these words, and sell that within all environments. Even our basic texts like ISO 9001 are typically manufacturing focused. The terminology, the tools, the texts, you recognize a production company. And I think this is a serious problem for quality management, that we do not translate the things we have developed in manufacturing into a service environment. And as a result, when somebody in the service industry gets interested in quality but looks at what we offer, he or she does not feel addressed to. This doesn't seem to talk about what he or she is involved with. So we really need something to do about this. Now, if we talk about lost in the unpredictable world and we talk about services, it is of course clear that services covers a very wide area. It goes from banking to restaurants to tourism, etc. I mean, it's a really wide area. However, no matter what industry you look at, you can see front end versus back end, also in services. And the front end part is obviously there where you have the personal contact, typically between a service provider and a customer. The other part of the organization can then be typically background processing. And you could say in banking, you have people that address you in a banking office, and then you have the back office where they do data processing. Actually, even in manufacturing environments, you have this personal contact area. Think about sales, think about after-sales services versus then background processing, people that very rarely come into direct contact with customers. Now, if you look at what quality focuses on, then it typically focuses on background processing. In manufacturing, that is pretty clear, but even the applications that you do see within service will typically be on background processing. In front-end interactions, human interactions, quality, we very rarely hear quality as such and quality tools as such being used. And the reason for that, I think, is because our classical quality tools are not really suited for a face-to-face service environment. And I've been struggling with this problem for a long time, and it was only when somebody pointed me to this model, the Cynefin model, that I understood where my problem lies and what we can do about it within quality. Now, the Cynefin model is a typical model where you work in quadrants and you have 4 areas. It is different from the classical quadrant models in that it does not have 2 axes with 2 states on each axis, which would make it a 2 by 2, meaning 4 possibilities. It's slightly different from that. And it is also containing a 5th element, the thing you see in blue here, called disorder. Now, what is the model about? The model starts to the right at the bottom, goes to top right, top left, bottom left. And the only division you could see is that on the horizontal axis you could say I make a distinction between the predictable world to the right and the unpredictable world to the left. Now this is very important and very special because of course we are very much acquainted with the predictable world. And the predictable world consists of two stages, two states, two habitats, places of belonging. You see, Cynefin is a Welsh word and it was developed by David Snowden when working for IBM, and it actually means place of belonging or habitat. Now, you can be in a simple state, which basically means it's something that we know, there's a best practice, and we should apply it. You can be in a complicated area, which is an area where there's a cause and effect relationship, but the problem is at this point we still don't know it. So you talk here about the known knowns and the known unknowns. We know that we do not yet know this. That's the complicated area. But then you switch to the unpredictable world and you have a complex area, and this is the unknown unknowns. And in the end, if you go on down, you enter into chaos. Things are happening. We don't even have a clue whether it's something we know or not know. It's chaos. Now, for the rest of the story, we'll forget the chaos, but we will focus on simple, complicated, and complex. And why is that? Because if we superimpose quality management onto this model, we see things that we recognize. And we see that something is missing. Okay. Now, what do we recognize? The simple area, this is typically what we would call standard work. There's a best practice, there's a cause-effect relationship, we know it, we know what to do, but for some reason we didn't do it. It's typically a problem with, you could say, discipline. You know, we have the rules, but we don't follow them. This is something we know. It can be the result of a PDCA improvement cycle, it's a procedure, it's an instruction, it's the result of a lean exercise, etc. In the complicated area, there are causes creating effects, but we don't know them yet. Now, I indicated in the previous slide, it are the known unknowns, but it are knowable unknowns. The only thing we lack at this point in time is the knowledge to make the link between the output and the inputs. It is the complicated world, but for us in quality, it's the world of, for instance, Six Sigma, root cause analysis type problems, where we have a myriad of tools and where we are very good at. However, then we go to the complex area. Now this is the area of unpredictability. These are the unknown unknowns. Now think about face-to-face services. A customer comes in. That customer is in no way to be compared with the previous customer and will not be able to be compared with the next customer. In other words, every new input starts more or less a new process. There is not really a cause-effect relationship. And for us in quality, that puts us into serious problems because our tools generally go from the preposition that there must be a cause-effect relationship. And that is where we have problems in our dealing with face-to-face services. That's also why Cynefin is so important for quality. because it allows us to understand the fundamental difference between complicated on the one hand and complex on the other. And it also shows that what works for complicated problems, which is actually basically analysis, investigating, does not work for complex problems. It's a different animal. And that means that our classical quality methods don't really work in this unpredictable world, in this habitat of complex problems. Because our quality habitat is actually a habitat of discipline and creativity, but all from the assumption that there is a relation between X and Y, between input and output. If it's simple, we've already decided, we've already defined it. In a more complicated situation, we need to define it. We know that there are vital fews and trivial manies. We have Pareto as a guideline, and we make models with the vital fews to predict the outputs. In fact, one of the things we can do is standardize and set the input. We'll define that the optimum temperature for a certain process has to be 73 degrees, and we can set that. Thanks to all that, we can also reduce variation. And we reduce variation in our process, and we ask the suppliers to our process to reduce variation in the inputs as well. Now, this is the habitat where we feel at home, whether it is simple or complicated. However, the human interaction habitat is a complex habitat, not a complicated one. In that habitat, variation is a given, because your input are people, they can't be standardized. You don't want to standardize them. In fact, in history, sometimes efforts have been done to do that with the most horrible results. As a consequence, each case is unique. As I said, the next customer has nothing to do with the previous one. So there's no real cause-effect relationship. There's no root cause. There are only vital manies. Now that's hard for us. And the question is, how can you handle this? Can we work on improving the quality of human interaction services? Well, in order to do that, we need to work on culture. But I think if there's any word that has been misused a lot within quality, it's culture. We need a different quality culture. And then that's a statement that kills every other thing. The question is, what does that mean? Well, I'll try to give you just one element of which I think that if the organization believes this and thinks in these terms, that actually you can start building not just a quality culture, but a customer-focused culture. Now, one of the best slogans we know is treat people the way you want to be treated. And that is a very general statement, and many people would agree with that. However, if you look at that in detail, it is an extremely egoistic and an extremely arrogant statement. Because the assumption you make here is that the rest of the world prefers to be treated the way you want to be treated. You don't know that. You haven't got a clue whether that is true. Actually, I'll tell you something that is by definition not true. So in order to build a customer-focused culture, the first thing you need to do is to think in these terms. Treat people the way they want to be treated. And if you want to treat people the way they want to be treated, you have to check how they want to be treated. You have to try and find out, and if you want to give good quality, you have to try and find out as quickly as possible. I'll give an example, because it's something that I personally feel like that. It's you go to a hairdresser. Okay, now that's a very face-to-face service industry. And a lot of the quality is the social interaction. So just as a side issue, in this presentation, I'm not talking about the technical quality of the service provider. I take it the hairdresser knows how to cut hair. I take it a nurse knows how to set an injection. We're talking about the social interaction. Now, hairdressers tend to be talkative people. They're social people. There's nothing wrong with that. Blah, blah, blah. Well, the blah, blah, blah is negatively meant. It could be very important things that are said there. There are also people that like hair a lot. So, you know, they tend to ask you about gel, about maybe coloring, about the new shampoo they want to use, about conditioner, etc., etc. Now, some customers love that, but not all. Okay. And when I said this is a little bit personal, I'm one of these people who goes to a hairdresser to get his hair cut. So I might think, please stop talking. Actually, most people wouldn't think as polite as is said there, but anyway. And I might think, no, forget all the gel, forget the coloring, etc. Just cut my hair, you see. And that is a critical thing. Now, when Snowden developed the Cynefin model, he gave for each quadrant of the model an approach to tackle that kind of problem. Also for the complex quadrant that we are talking about here. What he is saying is that if you're in such a complex environment, you need to find out what the situation is, because it are the unknown unknowns. So you need to probe with small experiments, sense what happens, and respond accordingly. If we take the example of the hairdresser again, and you want to behave in such a way that you're in line with what a customer likes, okay, treat people the way they want to be treated, then actually when you get a new customer in, you could probe with small experiments. You could ask a few simple things or start talking about basic things, the most basic thing being the weather. And then you need to sense what happens. How does this customer react? Does he start talking? Is he talkative? Does he want to interact? Is he looking for social contact, etc., etc.? Well, in that case, I'll be social. I'll talk a lot. I can probe with something about hair. Maybe, maybe ask, did you ever color your hair? And if the customer reacts no, and I would never ever do that, I know I shouldn't continue on talking about that. So what Snowden is saying here is actually use this probe, sense, respond approach, and that'll give you the best chances of success. And I think the hairdresser example is a good one to show how it can work. Now, the problem with the complex area is that it is complex. And if you're dealing with people, you have a big complexity because humans are complex creatures. Even small experiments can go wrong. Even a simple question can create a totally different reaction. Sometimes actually the situation you are in is already by definition a tricky one. Think about customer complaints where a customer brings in a faulty product or something like that. So as we are talking about quality and quality management, we obviously want to improve. We know in this environment it'll never be perfect. So don't look for perfection, but we do want to improve the success rate. Okay? And in order to do that, I make the proposition to add 2 steps to the proposal made by Snowden of probe, sense, respond. And the 2 steps are one at the start and one at the end. At the start, I would say observe, because careful observation can already teach you a lot. the way somebody enters a room, what that person says on entering the room is interesting and can already teach you something. It's a little bit learn to see human behavior. Many of you may know the famous book Learning to See, about value stream mapping and learning to see processes. Well, here we need to learn to see people. That's at the start, but at the finish, equally important. People are different, one from the other, but in time they tend to be more stable. So somebody who is not very talkative on his first visit will very likely not be very talkative on his second visit either. And it's important to remember that, because people are creatures of habit, and if you as a service provider remember their habits, that tends to delight them. Okay? And if you add these things together, this leads to a 5-step way with, of course, you can have an approach at the center, observe carefully, probe with appropriate experiments, sense what happens, respond accordingly, and remember. And by doing that, by getting this ingrained in an organization, and specifically in a service organization, you can work on higher customer satisfaction and on a real quality culture and a customer-focused culture. However, it's not always that easy, because all of this needs to happen within boundaries. This is not about giving in to everything a customer wants. You can't. I mean, some things need to be accepted, some things need to be done. Somebody brings in a faulty product, it is outside of the warranty period. Yes, we can repair it, however, it will cost a certain amount of money. You will need to explain that to somebody in front of you who's already very angry. That's why front-end service is such hard work, and actually it should be appreciated much more within organizations. Some things need to be done. Very few patients like injections, hardly any, I guess. But if for a certain medical treatment you need an injection, you will need that injection. And again, it'll be your role as a service provider to try and bring people in such a state that they are maximum at ease with the injection. But it has to happen. Okay. Now, how can you work on this improvement? How can you, in your organization, and especially if in your organization there's a large part face-to-face service, improve this? Well, of course, you need to create a customer-focused culture, and again, that is very much treat people the way they want to be treated. Focus on attitude and pride, and it is honorable to serve. As I said before, I think people that do these jobs are not always appreciated enough for the work they do. It is honorable to serve, and vice versa, caring shows. If somebody really cares about what happens to the customer, that customer will feel that, will recognize that. So the things you need to do is, of course, organize training, explain this model, tell to people what you want to achieve with that, and a good way of doing it is by holding group meetings on the observing, probing, sensing, responding, and remembering. Discuss and evaluate boundaries. How far can we go in various areas that are very different things? What sort of problems are we confronted with? What sort of reactions do we see from people? What were the successes? In the sense that somebody may say, well, I've already seen 2 or 3 times, if a customer does this, when you then say that, it tends to calm them down. This is important. You know, you exchange things that work and maybe equally important, you exchange things that do not work or that make people angry. So you exchange tips and tricks. You can create certain mental scenarios, standard probing schemes, things where you say, well, you know what, the safest is to first ask this and then ask this, and then based on that you can try this and that. It'll never be 100%, It'll never be 100%, but it can help. So discussing with colleagues is important, but also very important, and preferably directly, is asking the customer, the patient, the person to whom you provide the service, how he or she feels with that service, because you will get feedback. And as I said, people feel if things are sincere or not. Let's have a look at an example of healthcare. Remember when I explained the Cynefin model, I said it's a typically quadrant model, but a little bit deviating from standard. One reason why it's deviating is because it has this central orientation sort of bubble, and that's because, of course, when you enter a situation, you may need to look around a little bit to understand what is really going on. Is this complex? Is this complicated? Is it chaos? Is it simple? Okay. And that also means that in any organization, you find different types of problems. Okay. Now in healthcare, a lot of the problems belong to the complicated area. Think about drug distribution, registration efficiency, waiting times, very important. Today also the big implementation of digital technology and that sort of thing. These are typically complicated problems. And actually, there are many articles, publications on Lean Six Sigma applications within that complicated area of healthcare. However, there's also a complex area, and there's in healthcare typically a double complex area. That there's the surgery, the doctor, the technical issues that sometimes can be complex because people are different, but of course their bodies are different. And although you know how to do a certain operation, things can always happen, and there's always be a sensing and a responding. And once you open a person, it'll never look exactly the same. So that's a complex technical area. We are talking here about the complex area in the caretaking, in the human interactions, and there are many human interactions in healthcare. And we're talking about observing, probing, sensing, responding, and remembering. And as I said, for the complicated healthcare, the classical quality methods work perfectly. But the question is that the most critical? Of course, it has to be. You're not out there to give people the wrong medication, but is this the most critical? And in fact, I have a little quote here that came from a TV series on terminally ill people and the hospitals in which they were treated. And one patient said the following: a little patience, a kind word, a listening ear are more valuable to my well-being than the medication I get. And actually, I think this is a very important statement, and it shows that the smile of the nurse actually does make a difference. So never ever underestimate the importance of human interactions in any activity that you are doing. And don't forget that every interaction is an opportunity. Whether it's an intake talk by administrative personnel, whether it is somebody bringing in food to the people in hospital, whether it is somebody coming in to clean the room, whether it's just someone passing by, all interactions matter, and all together they will show your customer-focused culture, and they will show your quality-focused culture. And actually, I think they will also bring a lot of employee satisfaction if you have good interactions with customers. And with that, I want to thank you very much for your kind attention and for listening into my presentations. If there are any questions, you can easily contact me through my email, willy@qsconsult.be, or through LinkedIn. Thanks again and have a great conference. Thank you.